Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Clements. I direct the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation. It is a rainy day, and so I'm particularly grateful to those of you who've joined us today. I also want to say that we're streaming this event today live on the Washington Note website and the New America Foundation's website. I'm going to admit something, I normally am not that thrilled with doing book events. We do so many book events that sometimes they become a drag. The one exception is this guy, and I mean this sincerely. Hooman Majd is not only cool, and he comes kind of with this entertainment industry cool. I used to live in West Hollywood, and I miss the coolness of the West Coast, even though he wasn't. He was a New York cool kind of guy, but he is. I don't know. I mean, this is bad given the conversation we just had, and maybe Iran is watching this and those will get into it. He is a little bit like a CIA agent. In the sense,
thanks, Steve.
Yeah, but I mean this in the fondest sense. My dad was in intelligence, and I remember my professor in college once saying, "Steve, you seem to move across borders and boundaries pretty. Does that come from your dad? Like you just ignore?" And actually, I think that's less true about me than it is about Hooman Majd, who not only moves in very interesting circles in entertainment and in journalism, and if you've read his articles in Vanity Fair and others, he is just one of the most captivating writers on any subject he's writing about. But it happens to be that within the subject of Iran, which is so important today, I think Iran and where the relationship with Iran goes is the defining challenge for this country right now. I would also put China on the same rank. And I would put some other issues on the same rank, but it is not less than any of the other great challenges that the United States has. And Hooman Majd essentially not only captures, he's able to kind of write and articulate views on the U.S., maintain an arm's length distance, but yet go, as he did, I think, in May, to Iran and manage not to get arrested. And if you read his stuff, it is interesting because it's the kind of material that Iran needs to hear. It's also the kind of material that American policy leadership needs to hear. It's highly instructive to both sides. And this book, which has just a great cover, it's kind of Andy Warhol does Khamenei, I guess, and others, is the Ayatollahs Democracy and Iranian Challenge. And of course, Hooman Majd is author of The Ayatollah Begs to Differ. He publishes everywhere, the New York Times, the New Yorker, Salon, GQ, Interview, and so on. But in my view, he's one of the freshest, most original thinkers that I wish was in Washington much more, but then he would be less cool in the end. But with that, and I mean this sincerely, so I don't really mean CIA agent, but I mean that you do operate in so many of these different environments, and I will always be glad to host a book event or article event for you at any time, and I will not say that about anyone else anymore. I'm now on record as saying I don't like all these book events. I want to pay great tribute to my friend David Aaron of RAND. He used to be, I guess, everybody's national security advisors, Walter Mondale's, et cetera, and David knows as well, and he's here today because of the significance of understanding this Iran dynamic much more. So without further adu, please welcome Hooman Majd.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you so much, Steve, for that great introduction. By the way, I'll go on record saying I hate book events too, but we have to do them because I'm not sure what a book event's supposed to be. You have readings sometimes, you have discussions, you have panels, you have to talk about this book. And it's interesting you brought up the CIA because just 2 weeks ago I was accused by the Iranian hardline media of being CIA agent. So it works. But I get accused by some people of being an Iranian agent, and some people about being a CIA. So I must be doing something right if I get accused from both sides, or at least I think I am. Steve is right about my background and who I am. I'm not an analyst, an Iran analyst. I don't sit in a think tank, or I don't sit in an academic environment and analyze Iran or think about Iran that much. I think about it all the time, obviously, but I don't try to come up with conclusions that are based on scientific analysis or political analysis. I'm a writer, so I just observe. My observations have led me to believe that there's not a lot of understanding among Americans, certainly, of Iran and what Iran means at a time when Steve is right, that Iran is probably the foremost problem in quotation marks, for the United States, and probably will be in the foreseeable future. I can't imagine a time when Iran is not an issue for America, one way or another, whether we come to some sort of agreement on the nuclear issue or some sort of agreement on Iraq and Afghanistan and Lebanon. I see people may have seen the scenes in Beirut yesterday on television where Ahmadinejad was greeted by tens of thousands, if not more, kind of screaming fans of rock star in Beirut, something that he is most definitively not in Iran, even though some people would argue that he still is got a certain amount of popularity, which he does, to be fair. And the scenes in Beirut, obviously, that some people may have seen on television, are not because of Ahmadinejad the person, although I do believe that among Hezbollah followers, he is personally quite popular. But if Mousavi had won the election and was visiting Lebanon this week instead of Ahmadinejad, there would have been the same scenes. The scenes are for Iran, not for Ahmadinejad the person necessarily, although I do think he does have some personal support as well in the Arab world and certainly among Shias in places like Lebanon. But I think Lebanon is an interesting thing yesterday because it shows the power of Iran to influence regional politics from Iraq, Afghanistan, obviously Lebanon now. That's something that I wanted to originally address when I thought about writing this book. And actually, when I thought about writing this book, the Ayatollahs Democracy seemed like a really great title to me. After the elections of 2009, it seemed like less of a good title. And a lot of people said, well, it's an ironic title. And I said, yes, it's an ironic title, but I've always believed actually that ever since the elections of 2009, that what happened in Iran in 2009 was actually not a bad thing for the future of democracy in Iran, or the future of a form of democracy. It's hard to say exactly what an Islamic democracy is, because even inside Iran, even among the Ayatollahs, they can't agree on what an Islamic democracy is. Former President Khatami believes one thing, Mehdi Karoubi believes another thing, Mr. Mousavi believes yet another thing, and obviously Mr. Ahmadinejad believes something altogether different. Ahmadinejad actually, ironically, is a layman as president, as the first layman since Raja'i was assassinated back in the early 80s, and actually has exhibited a kind of disdain for the clergy, even though he has claims to be have mystical connections to the Messiah, the Mahdi. He certainly doesn't have an Islamic veneer in the way that clerics such as Rafsanjani as president, Khamenei was president, or supreme leader now, or Khatami as president had. But they all kind of disagree on what an Islamic democracy is. But what most Iranians agree on is that there can be a democracy in Iran in the future, and that it will have an Islamic veneer. It is impossible for there not to be an Islamic veneer in the same way that there is a Judeo-Christian veneer to our democracy. The idea that Islam is incompatible with democracy is only true if you believe that it has to be a theocracy and not a democracy. The fact is also that there are many people within the system in Iran that are fighting for democracy, that are trying very hard to bring about a democracy, not a revolution, but a democracy. And that democracy, as I said, depending on which group of people will ultimately be the winners in this long battle, and it's not a short-term battle, will determine what that form is going to be. As Khatami said when he was president once, he gave a speech where he said, democracy in Iran is going to be impossible without Islam. And he said, if you take Islam out of it, we will become a dictatorship. And that was before some people accused the current government of being a dictatorship. But I think that he was probably right, because he recognized that the people in Iran still want Islam to play a big part in their lives. It does play a big part in their lives for most people. Now, there are going to be people who are completely secular and don't believe Islam should play any role in political life or in social life even. There are always going to be those people. But right now, at this moment, they are not the majority of people in Iran. What that means is that the evolution of Iran toward a democracy is going to involve Islam for a very long time. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily good or bad thing for America either. We had made the mistake, and this is one of the things, after the elections of 2009, one of the things I had to think about again for my book, which I'd been already started writing, was, how do you take into account what happened in 2009 in Iran when you talk about a democracy or a future democracy, the Ayatollahs Democracy? And it's very difficult. I felt like I had to talk about the elections of 2009, what happened in the lead up to the elections, what happened in the elections themselves, what happened in the subsequent to the elections. It was important. So I opened this book with a discussion of that, of all that. But I've, not being an academic, I haven't written it in an academic form. I've written it as a play. And some people may like it, some people may dislike it. But the ultimate conclusion that I draw from what happened in 2009 is that we made a lot of mistakes on the outside. People outside of Iran made a lot of mistakes in terms of our analysis, our thought, what we were thinking was happening in Iran. And as such, it actually harmed, in my opinion, it harmed this so-called Green Movement. And this is based on not just my own opinion, based on conversations I've had with leaders of the Green Movement. We had at the time many people talking about a Twitter revolution, a Facebook revolution, people talking about the Green Revolution. To this day, people still talk about it as the Green Revolution. And I try to discourage people from calling it a revolution because that plays right into the hands of the hardliners in Iran who want to portray the Green Movement leaders and the Green Movement itself as a revolution, as a sedition, in fact. That's what they call it now because revolution means an overthrow of the system. Just yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, in the European edition of the Wall Street Journal, there was an op-ed piece published which said that the United States should be supporting the opposition to the revolutionary Islamic government of Iran. And that the only way the nuclear issue will be solved is if this government, if this regime falls, and the only way this regime is going to fall is if we fully support the opposition to the Islamic regime. Well, that's just ignoring what the reality is. The reality is that the people who are the leaders of this opposition are very much a part of this regime, even though they're on the outs with this government and with the supreme leader right now. But they're part of this regime. They never intended their movement to be an overthrow of the system. And as President Obama recognized very early before the election, where he said basically, and he was criticized by many Iranians in the diaspora for this, but he said that there's going to be, as far as the United States was concerned, there was really no difference who won the election, whether it was Mousavi or Ahmadinejad, because he recognized that the nuclear policy of Iran, which was the primary concern of the United States, and the secondary concern, Iran's support for Hamas and Hezbollah, was not going to change with the change of presidents in Iran. A lot of things would have been better, I believe, for Iranians in Iran, but that's not the concern of the United States, or at least wasn't the concern of the United States until a couple of weeks ago when the U.S. decided to sanction Iranian officials for human rights abuses. But when I wrote this book, I was thinking that it was important for people to understand, Americans to understand the political culture of Iran, which is very complex, and not just the political system, which I obviously describe in the book to the degree that I'm capable of describing, but also the political culture of Iran, which involves what the people think, how people react to the politics in Iran. And I've always tried to, I've always felt like it's not my place to be an activist, to say, down with the Islamic Republic or up with the Islamic Republic. It's my place to observe, my place to write about what I see and what I know and the people that I can talk to. And I also try to talk to all kinds of people, not just supporters of the system or not just opponents of the system, but all kinds of people. And I've felt that in describing what happened in 2009 as a revolution or as an attempt to overthrow the system altogether, the mistake we made was we weren't really paying attention to what Iranians were actually saying. Initially, obviously, we understood that they wanted the election to be, they wanted a recount or a complete rerunning of the election because of the massive fraud that the losing candidates claimed. And in fact, there was a recount. It wasn't significant enough, and it wasn't going to make a difference. So the opposition continued to demand that the election be rerun. And afterwards, subsequent to that, after the brutal repression of protesters on the street, they basically that demand that there be a recount once Ahmadinejad was confirmed as president didn't mean anything anymore. Then it was becoming an opposition to this government. To this day, none of the opposition leaders have come out and spoken against the system and said we want to change the system to this day. Some people accuse, in the West, will accuse they will suggest that the opposition leaders are afraid to say that. I haven't found that to be true. I think that the opposition leaders have been very brave in almost everything they've said and everything they've done. They have come very close to suggesting that the system is failing. They've actually said, and a couple of them have actually said the system is failing, but they haven't said that the system is failing means that we have to overthrow the system in the same way that in America when people say government doesn't work, it doesn't mean that people think, Tea Party says the government doesn't work. It doesn't mean they want to throw away the Constitution and write it again, all over again. Mr. Karoubi just recently gave an interview and he suggested that there need to be constitutional changes, and I believe that's the case in the case of the Green Movement leaders, that they're not just looking now to work on their civil rights agenda, and it is a civil rights agenda, but also to see if they can move towards getting the Constitution changed in the long term. Now, question, of course, everybody will ask is, well, how, once you have a supreme leader who can be the final authority and has dictatorial powers, even if he hadn't used them up until, or hadn't always used them up until 2009, how can you ever have a democracy? Well, the truth of the matter is the supreme leader does have dictatorial powers and always had dictatorial powers, just as Ayatollah Khomeini had dictatorial powers. But he was also, up until 2009, recognized that you couldn't use them under the system because there were too many different checks and balances, too many different groups of people who advised him, who were powerful, who had their own constituencies, that if he tried to use the dictatorial powers, that it would result in something like 2009. So I think he's discovered that trying to use his dictatorial powers could potentially result in the kind of upheaval that Iran cannot survive too often. It's managed to survive this one intact, but it's hard to say if it could survive another bout like it had in 2009 in terms of the millions of people coming out on the street. That obviously is not going to happen in the near future anyway. People ask me all the time, especially since I've been to Iran since the election, well, how are they going to come and demonstrate? Are they going to take part in civil disobedience and all that? It's hard to say. I think that the people that I speak to, and I speak to a lot of from different levels of society, are disappointed in what happened in 2009. A lot of people inside Iran, they're disappointed that their cries were not heard by the government. They're disappointed that they were unable to get what they wanted, or at least even be paid any attention to by the government. So there's a lot of disappointment on that level. Some people want to blame the Green leaders for not going far enough, for not pushing the people to support them to the point of where they would go and march on the president's compound, or take over the radio station, or turn it into a revolution. But that was never what their intention was. Their intention was never to overthrow the system. At least the leaders of the Green Movement, it wasn't their intention to overthrow the system, and they're unlikely to do that today. So it's hard to say whether there will be that kind of resurgence of the Green Movement. John Lee Anderson went to Tehran a month after I was there, and he came back and he said, he writes for the New Yorker, he said, the Green Movement's dead. And for all intents and purposes, if you fly to Tehran today and you try to find a sign of the Green Movement, you're not going to see it. It's not going to be there. When I was there, I drove all over Tehran, and I found one sign on an underpass, a highway underpass, which said, "Death to Khamenei," and it was gone within a day. So, but there, you see those little things, but it's very hard to see a Green Movement active in Iran. But most people in Iran don't spend their time thinking about the green movement either. Most people in Iran spend their time thinking about jobs and thinking about how they're going to make money and how they're going to live. The green movement has become something that is still there. It's still bubbling. And I disagree with people who say it's gone completely and the civil rights movement is dead and, that's it. It's still there. But if you ask me, and people ask this all the time, not just me, they ask all kinds of analysts, well, what's the future of the green movement? The question is, I don't know, because I know that they're working. I know that the leaders of the green movement at the very top and the ones who haven't been arrested on the secondary level are still working very hard. Some are working in ways that are not very obvious. Ayatollah Rafsanjani, who is not officially, bless you, in the green movement, is working very hard to bring about some changes. At the same time, while all this is happening, while these leaders are trying to figure out how to be effective and how to have an effective civil rights movement that can't come out on the streets anymore, or if it tries to come out on the streets, will have a visible presence in Iran and in the media, will be crushed as it was the last time round. While they're trying to figure this out, we have a policy towards Iran that is not, unfortunately, in my mind, at least according to the people that I speak to in Iran, is not helping them. It's not helpful at all. Sanctions, I don't want to get too deep into this, but sanctions, which a lot of the Iranian diaspora actually support because they feel that sanctions is going to put pressure on this government and pressure is going to make it eventually fall. With enough pressure, it's going to fall. Well, Iran has been under sanctions for 30 years. Now, it's true, as Ayatollah Rafsanjani said a few weeks ago, that these sanctions are probably more serious than any sanctions they've faced before. But the Iranians, as a former Iranian ambassador to the UN said, are actually allergic to threats. This Iranian regime is allergic to threats. And I think that's very true because when you look at the leadership, whether the leadership is the people in the Ahmadinejad government, people in the regime, people in the opposition even, it's a generation of people who were revolutionaries in 1979, some of them younger than others. Most of them fought in the Iran-Iraq War. Most of them have lived through sanctions and have lived through threats by the United States and in more recent years by Israel as well. They don't respond to threats. They don't respond very well to threats at all. And as long as the regime feels like it can manage the economy, although it's not doing a very good job of that, manage the economy and manage governmental affairs, it's not going to crumble because of sanctions. It's also certainly not going to change its mind when it comes to the nuclear issue because of sanctions. That's not going to happen. And that's not me saying it. That's what they're saying. And it's not even when I say they, I don't mean Ayatollah Khamenei, who obviously says that, or President Ahmadinejad, who obviously says that. This is the Green people who are saying it too, the opposition. Now, I'm not going to speak about the opposition to the regime, which is mostly based outside of the country. That's a different topic. But the people who are viable in Iran, who are still viable, whether it's people like the clerics in Qom who are against what the Ahmadinejad administration are against what Khamenei has done in the last year, or you talk about Khatami and Rafsanjani who are much more cautious and want to remain relevant, or even Mousavi who still has support and Karoubi who still has support. Not one of them agrees that sanctions is either going to help the situation or is either going to benefit them or is going to help the situation with the nuclear issue or is going to do anything in terms of changing the Iranian leadership's mind about the nuclear issue. Not one of them has said that. Every single one has said sanctions hurt, including the most recent human rights sanctions, which is looked at as being, certainly the people that I've spoken to, has looked at being as related to the nuclear issue, even though the United States claims it's not. It claims it's a human rights issue. Well, if it was a human rights issue, why weren't those sanctions imposed back in June and July of 2009? The fact that they're being imposed now, these human rights sanctions against the 8 Iranian officials, in combination with the economic sanctions, to the Iranians smacks like pressure to make them, additional pressure to force them to relent on the nuclear issue. Well, that's just not going to happen. The sanctions are kind of meaningless. They're certainly meaningless to the Green Movement today, a year and a half later, to sanction people for the abuses of 2009. So, where is the U.S. administration policy with respect to Iran? It's to continue to impose these sanctions and put more pressure on Iran in order to force Iran to give up its, basically at the end of the day, to give up its right to enrich uranium, something that no Iranian inside Iran, when I say no Iranian, certainly nobody in the leadership and nobody in the opposition is willing to do. The opposition criticized the Ahmadinejad government for adventurism, they call it, and they criticize him for the things he says which are not helpful. I myself, the reason I was called a CIA agent by the Iranian media last couple of weeks ago was because I myself will criticize Ahmadinejad as well and say he is not helpful to Iran's cause, especially when he brings up 9/11 at the United Nations 9 years after the fact. That does nothing for. I'm not the only one who criticizes him. There are websites in Iran which are still available and not been blocked that have criticized him heavily for that. One of the websites is run by Sadegh Kharazi. It's called Iranian Diplomacy, and they've been fiercely critical of Ahmadinejad in the last few weeks, and particularly after the UN thing. But they're also nationalists. These are people who are against the Ahmadinejad government. People who were in the Green Movement. They were in the campaign for Mousavi. Some of them were in the campaign, worked in the campaign for Karoubi, and a couple of them worked in the campaign that I know for Rezai. But they are fierce nationalists, and they all say that sanctions aren't going to work. They all say that the nuclear policy of Iran is not going to change. The language might change if they were in power, but the policy is not going to change. And at the same time, we have people here in America who are analysts and talking about the fact that this regime is ultimately, it's impossible to deal with this regime or negotiate with this regime because, as I call it, psychoanalyzing the supreme leader from 8,000 miles away, because the supreme leader believes, and the hardliners around him believe, that anti-Americanism is the only thing that is keeping this regime together, and that they never want relations with the United States, because if they have relations with the United States, then the regime will crumble. That's an argument, but I disagree with that because, again, some people who are close to the supreme leader and are actually still in the opposition to Ahmadinejad have said the exact opposite. I'll mention Mr. Kharazi again, who was a former ambassador under the Khatami government and is a top advisor to Khatami, former President Khatami. He wrote an article on his website saying that and he's very close to the supreme leader as well because he's related to him. So even though they're on opposite sides of the political spectrum now, he said it's absolutely not true that the supreme leader believes that anti-Americanism is the foundation of the regime, and if that were ever to fall, then the regime would fall. He said that, in his opinion, and I trust him because he's not been wrong up until now in what he's told me or what he's said publicly. It's what the supreme leader himself has said, is that if America enters into negotiations or wants to enter into negotiations with Iran from a position of mutual respect and respects Iran, then he has no problem with it. Up until now, he has not seen a sign of that. So obviously when we impose sanctions, or then when we impose human rights sanctions on Iran, it's not that I don't believe those individuals should be sanctioned or should be called out for their abuses of the Iranian people. It's just that from the Iranian perspective, if you're sitting in the Iranian government or inside the Iranian regime, you say, well, they're sanctioning us, they're singling us out when they don't single out their own allies, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, all the countries that have actually, in some cases, human rights records that may not compare favorably to even Iran. It's not viewed as something that is real. It's viewed, among the leadership at least, as pressure to overthrow this system. Basically, that Iran is a system of government. It's a regime that the United States cannot live with under any circumstances. And if that's true, which I'm not saying it is, but if that's true, then unfortunately we get to this place where we say, well, what are the alternatives? Because we're not going to be able to, I don't think, we're not going to be able to get them to change their behavior, as President Obama has said, by sanctions or pressure or economic sanctions, anything like that. And where I don't think it's very likely that we're going to be able to make Iran a different country by force, by military force. Be able to change the regime by military force. I mean, technically we can. We changed the regime in Iraq by military force. Technically we could do that. I don't know if it's going to be helpful in the long run in terms of U.S. relations with Iran, and whether the Iranians would actually become more radical as a government in light of an invasion, for example, or a military action against Iran. So what's left is negotiations, diplomacy, something that we have not been as keen on, even though President Obama has suggested from when he campaigned onwards that he was keen on negotiations, diplomacy. The problem, as far as the Iranians is concerned, is that you can't enter into negotiations with sticks as well as the carrots. They're very, very. They don't like that term, carrots and sticks, and they see it being. They see the effects of carrots and sticks is that there's these sanctions and this pressure and there's two tracks, as Hillary Clinton says, the pressure track and the negotiations track. Well, Iran says, well, we're not going to deal with you under those circumstances. Rightly or wrongly, that's what they're saying, and I think that that's an obstacle that nobody wants to really address now, because it's now conventional wisdom that sanctions are we have to impose sanctions on Iran. We have to put pressure on Iran, or else maybe the Israelis will go and bomb them, or whatever the reason is. But we can't just sit here and talk about talking while Iran is doing the things it's doing, which is mainly enriching uranium. But anyway, that I may have gotten a little off track in terms of sanctions and all that. But one thing I do want to say about the sanctions, the fact that they do affect ordinary people in Iran, which is the main reason why the opposition to the government in Iran is against sanctions, because it affects ordinary people, but also because they recognize that it's not going to make any difference to the regime. And in some ways, it helps the regime to be able to label the opposition as being foreign-backed. When you have articles written in the media, when you have Hillary Clinton saying she hopes that the opposition would be successful in getting rid of Ahmadinejad, that just, again, the hardline media in Iran immediately accuses the reformists of being, if at best, stooges of the United States, if not actually allies of the United States in trying to overthrow the system. But one thing I do want to say before I finish, because I know you want to do a Q&A, one thing I do want to say is that if the nuclear issue could be resolved, and I do believe it can be resolved. I mean, President Ahmadinejad, time and time again, has said, his foreign minister just said it again this week, that they want to talk and they want to resolve the nuclear issue. Ahmadinejad has said in his own wacky way that he wants to sit down with President Obama. And the way he says it obviously doesn't make sense. I want to hold a debate with President Obama at the UN. Of course, the U.S. president's not going to sit down and debate Ahmadinejad at the UN. It's not a presidential election that he's fighting Ahmadinejad for the presidency of the United States. So he's not going to debate him. But there's never a response to that from our side. And I don't think there's any question, even though the Supreme Leader did say at the time of the UN or right before the UN that the time was not right for negotiations between the United States and Iran. There is a real desire on the part of virtually the entire leadership, and some would argue that the Supreme Leader doesn't want it, or the very hardline Revolutionary Guards don't want it, but there is a desire to normalize relations on some level. And certainly, from the Green Movement's perspective, taking this nuclear issue off the table and resolving some of the other issues where there's pressure on Iran, external pressure on Iran, would actually help the civil rights movement. Because, and I specifically have asked them this, because if you take away that distraction, which the government can now use, it's like, well, we're under threat. We're going to be bombed, or we may be bombed. The Israelis are threatening us. America's threatening us. We've got all these sanctions. We have to unify. We have to unify. We have to become united. We can't have internal dissent. We can't have that. It's not that unlike what happened in America post 9/11. And people always assume that Iranians are different creatures from a different planet. I mean, human beings are human beings. If you think that you're under the threat of attack, if you think there's a potential for your country to be attacked, or these kinds of pressures, there is a good chance that people are going to unify. I mean, people who despised George Bush, absolutely despised him, and didn't think he even won the election in 2000, they kind of united post 9/11. People were like, well, I remember a Democratic friend of mine who hated George Bush, despised him. I live in New York, so I was there during 9/11. Called me on 9/11 and said, "Thank God George Bush is president." It's like, so, you do get that from people who feel that they're under attack. And I think the Green Movement leaders recognize this, that as long as these issues are there, as long as Iran is accused of, wanting to build a nuclear weapon, or is under threat, or we will not allow this to happen, or the Israelis say, we can't let Iran have even the capability of building a nuclear weapon, well, it's going to be very hard for them to focus on civil rights. It's going to be very hard for people to fight for their rights, or even fight for anything that's not related to the issues at hand right now. It's hard for these guys to even criticize the government on the economy, which is one vulnerable place where the government can be accused, in which most Iranians, if you ask them if they don't support their government, it's because of the economy. The vast majority of people usually don't support their government because they don't have a job, or they're not making enough money, or there's horrible inflation. It's not because of foreign policy, generally speaking, that they don't support them. So the sanctions and the nuclear issue, and the support for Hamas and Hezbollah, if these were kind of resolved on some level, I think you could see Iran move towards that democracy that it's seeking, at least the Iranian people are seeking, and the opposition to Ahmadinejad is seeking, although Ahmadinejad claims that Iran's the most democratic country in the world because he got 85% of the vote. And where does that happen in the world? Only in Iran. And there's freedom of speech, and there's no political prisoners, and all that. But what Ahmadinejad said about that is actually interesting, because I've always maintained that if you ask any Iranian hardliner, supporter of Ahmadinejad, supporter of Khamenei, any of them, any time, and I've actually asked this question, do you believe there should be political prisoners? Do you believe in freedom of speech, or do you believe in freedom of the press? They'll all say no, yes, and yes. Nobody will say, I believe that there should be no political freedom. Nobody will say, I don't believe that there, except for a handful of people who I have not asked, like Mesbayazdi, Ayatollah Mesbayazdi, who actually comes out and says, I don't think there should be freedom. But there are very few of those. Most people believe that there should be freedom of speech. These are things that are guaranteed in the Iranian constitution. There are other things in the constitution that need to be amended as far as the reformists are concerned, and that can happen. But it can't happen under the circumstance of potential war, or the circumstance of sanctions, or being under attack by the West. That's not going to happen. So anyway, I've talked way too long about this. So
thank you very much, Samantha. Thank you. I don't know if this is working. Team or my guys? How does this work? There we go. Thank you so much, Hooman. Let me open a question to you, and then open the floor so we can have more of a conversation. I'm going to lean on this chair because I'm jet lagged from China. It was an odd moment around January of this past year when a senior Israeli government official, and we will call a good friend of Israeli interests in the National Security Council, both told me that oddly, Ahmadinejad was our friend in the Tehran research reactor deal, and that he was very much trying to come forward with a deal that we thought was going to work, and that it was going to create at least a railroad track, not of trust, but of a beginning of a process. And they had actually agreed to it. The negotiator went back, and both the negotiator and the president of Iran found that the ground that they thought they had fell apart. Yesterday, I met with a senior Israeli government official who has access to high-quality intelligence from their end, And he said, it's nice to report to you, Steve, that there's some good news in Iran, that we're not hyperventilating because we see some of the sanctions having an effect, that they think that Iran is going to come back in a couple of weeks with a proposal of the P5+1. Probably is not going to solve anywhere near all the problems, but the process will begin again. And that the question they have is, will there be a repeat or not? Will there be a holistic negotiating position for the Iranian government? And I guess that's an interesting thing to hear from the Israelis, that rather than, a kind of hyperbolic formula for hitting back. And it gave me some hope that something may be happening here, even though I'm a big skeptic of sanctions. I might be wrong. Mm-hmm. But in that, when you look at these players, where is Khamenei vis-a-vis Ahmadinejad today? Where is Rafsanjani? I mean, how it seems so fluid. What can you believe, and what should we believe, and what should we not believe when it comes to sort of dealing with the government today?
Well, it's a very difficult question because, first of all, very few people have access to Khamenei, who is obviously the ultimate, the decider, as George Bush would say in Iran. It's definitely not Ahmadinejad. And his support for Ahmadinejad kind of wavers, depending on the day of the week sometimes. But it depends on where Ahmadinejad stands on a particular issue, or when he feels. Khamenei has a few very trusted advisors. The Larijani brothers, for example, the three Larijani brothers, three of them, are very close to him, and he does take their advice. Not one of them is close to Ahmadinejad. In fact, Ali Larijani is probably the most anti-Ahmadinejad of the three. So he takes advice from them. And when, for example, Ali Larijani, who is the Speaker of the Parliament, feels like Ahmadinejad is ignoring the Parliament, you have to assume, not that I know this for a fact, you have to assume that in their at least weekly meetings that I've heard, that Ali Larijani brings this up with the Supreme Leader. And then you see the Supreme Leader reacting in a way, he doesn't get on the phone and scream at Ahmadinejad as far as I know. Maybe he does, but or he doesn't write a public or make a public statement about Ahmadinejad or the government. But you see signs. You definitely see signs. You see like him giving some ground to, for example, Ayatollah Rafsanjani, and then taking it away.
Who's back?
He's been rehabilitated. He was, since the election of 2009, they stopped calling him in the media. They stopped calling him Ayatollah, which was a big demotion for him. They didn't call him anything, just Hashemi Rafsanjani. And just about a month ago, they started calling him Ayatollah again, which was definitely Kayhan, which is basically the mouthpiece for the Supreme Leader, does not start calling someone Ayatollah without the approval of the Supreme Leader, and does not stop calling someone Ayatollah without the Supreme Leader's approval. But on the other hand, the Supreme Leader also this week made a move against Rafsanjani as well. So this is balancing act that he has. His move was on the Islamic Azad University and the endowment, which Rafsanjani had said it was like, it was an act of God, the endowment, and then Khamenei disagreed, said, no, I'm the representative of God. I'll tell you whose act it is. So that was kind of a diss on...
And he said it was not God's act.
It was not God's act, yeah. He didn't say it wasn't God's act. He said it was actually un-Islamic. So yeah, anything that's un-Islamic is obviously against God. So he balances it. It goes back and forth in terms of his support for... The one thing we do know is that the Supreme Leader does support Ahmadinejad when it comes to foreign policy. One of the things that I've learned over the last couple of years, and it was definitely cemented by the elections of 2009, is that the Supreme Leader and some of his advisors feel and have felt for a long time that anybody but an extreme hardliner is dangerous if they're going to be dealing with foreign policy at all. Because I don't believe actually that the Supreme Leader really believes that Khatami, for example, or Rafsanjani, or even Mousavi want to overthrow the system and get rid of him. I don't think he really believes that. They would all be dead now if he really believed that. But he thinks that they're much more easily duped by the West, and he believes this aggressive foreign policy by Ahmadinejad, even some of the aggressive rhetoric, helps Iran rather than hurt it. there are a lot of people who disagree with that, obviously, but he thinks that they can, at best be duped or actually be convinced by Westerners, for example. People like Khatami are too fond of the West, or they're too, generous in their description of Western democracy, and they could easily be duped by Westerners into doing something that they shouldn't be doing, for example. And that the problem with that is, and I talk about it a little bit in this book, is the problem is partly our fault. I mean, under President Khatami, who was elected twice by a big majority, despite the fact that the Supreme Leader openly backed his opponent, didn't want him to win, but he obviously accepted it. At that time, he was accepting of the people's wish. Khatami and his associates, his close associates, and especially the ones who have strong connections to the Supreme Leader, spent a lot of time convincing him that his method his foreign policy agenda was correct, to repair relations. Rafsanjani started it with repairing relations in the immediate neighborhood with the Arabs and then Africa. Khatami extended that to Europe and the United States. Reaching out, certainly the relations with European countries was excellent under President Khatami, partly because he was able to convince, again, the Supreme Leader and the system to not revoke the fatwa, because you can't revoke a fatwa by someone who's died, but to say that we're not going to act on the fatwa against Salman Rushdie. That was helpful in getting relations with England, for example, and then the European Union back on track. And then the outreach to the United States. The outreach to the United States was genuine on the part of President Khatami, and our response to that was a kind of response that enabled the opposition to Khatami, the hardliners, to go to the Supreme Leader and say, well, see, this is actually, you can't trust the Americans. If you're nice to them, this is what happens. And what I'm specifically speaking about is not the offer to negotiate in 2003. That's already after the fact. It's the post 9/11, immediately after 9/11, where there was an agreement with the Iranians, and this is where Flint Leverett and his wife have intimate knowledge of this, where they were actually negotiating with the Iranians on Afghanistan in particular, and then subsequent to that being called the Axis of Evil. It's like, on that moment, Khatami knew that basically the reformists were dead. The hardliners had won at that moment, because everything that he had done, everything he had said, and all his associates had done to convince the Supreme Leader to go along with helping America toward, with the hope that there could be a better relationship and actually normalization of relations, died that moment when Iran was put into the axis of evil. It's like, okay, well, you can't trust these Americans. You be nice to them. This is how they react.
Well, let me go to the floor. But since you've mentioned Flint, I would also like to know where you think Flint gets it wrong in the process. But we'll come back to that later. Let's go to this gentleman. We have a mic in here. Great, thank you.
Greg Thielman, Arms Control Association. Thank you for your observations. It's very interesting. I was surprised, though, the way you characterized the heart of the nuclear dispute. It's certainly the Iranian narrative that we are trying to prevent them from having the ability to enrich uranium. Mm-hmm. But I think from a UN and an International Atomic Energy Agency perspective, the issue is not that Iran or every other signatory to the NPT has a right to peaceful pursuit of nuclear energy, but rather that there are obligations that go along with that right for transparency. Iran has withdrawn its agreement to do the additional protocol, the additional measures that other countries are moving toward. Iran is the only country in the world that asks for a different kind of notification arrangement than every other member of the NPT. So I guess my question is, if we made it very clear, and we're not making it very clear, that the only obstacle to the removal of the sanctions and continued Iranian enrichment of uranium is this transparency issue, what would the reaction in Iran be? Is the sensitivity to IAEA inspectors so great that there would still be no possibility of an agreement?
No, I think that's a good question. I don't think. The reason I brought up the enrichment is that we want to prevent enrichment is because that's the way the Iranians look at it, is because the UN sanctions specifically say are sanctions imposed by the United Nations so that Iran suspends enrichment of uranium. That's it, suspends. Yeah, that's what it says. Iran did suspend enrichment under President Khatami for 2 years, which is why there were no sanctions. And in the negotiations, what was promised Iran was that the EU and the P5+1 would come back to Iran after they suspended enrichment, which was verified by the IAEA, with an offer of what the deal was going to be moving forward. And the offer was, as Larijani described it, trading a pearl for a lollipop. It was a very ambiguous offer. It's like, well, if you make the suspension permanent, we'll consider allowing you into the World Trade Organization. We'll consider selling you none of it was hard. None of it was like, okay, you can buy Boeings, you can buy military hardware from us, you can join the WTO, we'll lift all the unilateral sanctions. There was nothing, or we'll lift one sanction, or we'll lift this if you promise. And it was also timed very badly. It was timed at the very, very end of Khatami's presidency. There was no chance to really react to it from his. And Ahmadinejad jumped at the opportunity to criticize Khatami, saying, well, this is what he would have done. He would have accepted this, which is actually not true. Khatami couldn't have accepted that deal either. But the issue that you bring up is important. Transparency is very important, I agree. Again, Iran signed the additional protocol under former President Khatami, but it wasn't ratified by the parliament. And they were smart not to ratify. It's like when we don't ratify something in the Senate, the treaties that do need to be ratified in the Senate, Iran didn't ratify it because they were waiting to see what the deal was offered. Because once they ratified the treaty in Parliament in Iran, then it would become part of Iran's obligation to the NPT and obligation to the IAEA, which then they couldn't move back from. They were waiting for this response that was supposed to come, the suspension of uranium. When the response came, they said, okay, well, we're not going to ratify the additional protocol now. It is my belief, and based on conversations I've had with people in Iran, that they would ratify the additional protocol. If that was the deal, that they would ratify the additional protocol, which would allow for a lot more transparency than today, as long as that right to enrich uranium was accepted, then they would ratify the additional protocol. I actually think that this whole enrichment issue is a red herring. I really do, because I think the one aspect of the Iranian nuclear program that we know everything about is its enrichment program. And even if they suspended enrichment, as the UN requires it to do so, there's one site where they're enriching uranium, and that site is under 24-hour camera observation of the IAEA. Inspectors do go in, so it is actually, as Ahmadinejad said, every gram of enriched uranium has been accounted for in Iran. So even if they did arguably suspend enrichment and the UN would then, they have satisfied the UN resolutions, then the UN would have to lift the sanctions because they suspended enrichment. We still wouldn't know if they have a secret enrichment site. That wouldn't help us. The only way we'll know if they're doing anything outside of what they are allowed to do under the treaty that they have signed is to have at least have the additional protocol signed. So to me, that seems like a very logical step. But we have, President Obama inherited this zero enrichment on Iranian soil. The right wing is all they're enriching uranium, so the next step is they can take it to the higher level and then they can build a bomb. The Israelis have continually said that enrichment is a big problem. The reality is that they know how to enrich uranium now. It's too late to stop them from gaining that knowledge. Suspending enrichment is not going to get us anywhere. The place that we could get to is get them to, and they have never indicated that they would not sign the additional protocol. Again, going back to one Iranian website that is actually the opposition, they're in opposition to Ahmadinejad. One of their analysts wrote an article this week that Iran would probably sign the additional protocol if the West stopped insisting that they stop enrichment. Because that's how does the government of Iran say to its people? How does the regime say to its people, you've suffered all these years because of this right that we protected for you? As I'm fond of saying to people, every cab driver in Tehran can tell you the articles of the NPT because the government has told them so many times that this is a right that we have. They know it. How are they going to turn around and say, we gave up that right? It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard for them to have legitimacy as this revolutionary government to say we gave up that right. So the additional protocol is a very good question because I actually think that the additional protocol would satisfy both sides in terms of what they want. But nobody seems to be talking about it.
Great. I'm going to encourage you to be a little more. I've got to go to some other, so I'll come back. But I'm going to encourage you to be a little more brief so we can get some more questions. Go ahead quickly, but wait for the microphone, please. Wait for the microphone, please.
No, it's just.
Yeah. We are on tape. I need you to talk to the microphone.
I just want to know the name of the website and writer of the article that you were just mentioning that they said that they will sign it.
I can't remember the name. I can't remember the name of the analyst, but the website was the Iranian Diplomacy.
Oh, it was.
Okay, great. David.
You seem to suggest that there is a consensus in Iran among all the players, including the opposition, to support the nuclear program. What is that program? Are they aiming for a weapon in your judgment? Has that decision been made, not made? What is there a consensus on their ultimate objectives?
Good question, and I'm going to piggyback on David Aaron's question, is that after having just spent a lot of time in China and also having gone to Moscow, the inside view in both those governments is that Iran is going towards either a Japan-like capacity or having a nuclear weapon, and China and Russia are building into their plans largely to acquiesce to it, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So I want to just put that on the table along with what.
Yeah,
with
I mean,
David's question.
it's a good question, and I don't think anybody has the answer to that. I think anybody who says that they know for a fact is delusional. I think that the ultimate decision is not going to be Ahmadinejad's. It's not going to be Larijani's. It's going to be a group decision, basically. Khamenei is not going to make that decision on his own either, I don't think, to actually build a bomb. I think that the thing that Steve brings up, which is the Japan model of breakout, the Iranians recognize that having the technology to enrich uranium gets them much closer to being able to build a bomb. And that's just a byproduct of what they want. They want the ability, I think, that's my view, that the ability, but I certainly don't think any decision's been made to let's go ahead and build a bomb. It's too risky for them. That kind of information, when you make a decision like that, I think that eventually it comes out. It's very hard to hide something like a nuclear weapons program, whether it's through intelligence, Israeli intelligence, American intelligence, British and German. And somehow that information comes out and turns the supreme leader into a supreme liar, a guy who said issued a fatwa against nuclear weapons and the use of nuclear weapons, both the development and the use of it. I don't think he wants to be a liar, to be proven a liar like that. To suddenly, here's this weapons program. When they do make the decision, it'll be very easy to rescind the fatwa. The minute Israeli warplanes bomb Natanz, the fatwa's gone, and Iran's building a nuclear weapon. And then they'll have a legitimate reason to do it, or American warplanes bomb. But I don't think they've made that decision. That's my own personal view. I don't think they've made that decision. I think it's too risky for them. And when you mention the opposition and across the political spectrum, I think the support is for the technology. The support is there for nuclear power. Everybody keeps mentioning France. 60% of their power comes from nuclear power plants. They do like the idea of being to save their oil and not use it for domestic purposes, save it for foreign sales. But I think the consensus among the people, including the opposition, is that we don't want to bomb. Khatami was very clear about that, and others have been as well.
Larry, did you have your hand up? No. The very back. No. Yeah, this gentleman here in the suit and tie.
Yes, I did. You answered my question.
You've got to use the microphone. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Jonathan Evans with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. My question was about what I would refer to as internal controls. That is, if fatwas have been issued, how effective are those as internal controls? I think you've started to answer that.
So the gentleman 2 seats in front of you.
And we have an
Yes,
Iranian.
Mayor, we're going to go to next.
Thank you,
Who can
Jeff
respond
Barron
to my
from
anti-Israeli
America.gov.
tirade?
I'm sorry. You said that if sanctions, nuclear issues, and support for Hamas and Hezbollah could be resolved, then the movement toward democracy could be, the way would be open for a movement to democracy. Would you say, though, that there's a fairly broad support for Hamas and Hezbollah among the Iranian people? It's not something that they're going to give up.
Thank you.
It's a good question. I don't think that the Iranian government's going to give up that support. I think there's a strong element of support, moral support for Hamas and Hezbollah among the population, including even among the Iranian diaspora, who don't seem to agree on anything. There's at least moral support. It goes along with the general anti-Israeli sentiment that exists in the Middle East in general, but it's certainly in Iran in particular. But yeah, there is moral support. I think there's question among some people in Iran, big question for some people, as to whether Iran should be spending that much money and sending arms to Hamas and Hezbollah. But in terms of moral support, I think there is a great deal of moral support for both those. And most Iranians don't consider them terrorist organizations. Or I shouldn't say most. I would say a lot of Iranians don't consider, and a lot of the Middle Easterners don't consider Hamas and Hezbollah terrorists, or certainly not in the way that we do.
Mayor Javadanfar, it's nice to meet you.
Nice to see you.
My question is this. Everybody tries to work out why Ali Khamenei supported Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in the last elections, because I agree with you completely that before that he had a very sophisticated system of checks and balances. It was spread across the system.
Mm-hmm.
But however, he kind of abandoned that when he gave such an open support to Ahmadinejad. I mean, before the elections, he said, treat yourself, he said to President Ahmadinejad, as if you're going to continue with your project, as if you're going to continue managing the country for another 5 years. He's never said that to Khatami when he was running.
Did. He actually did say that to Khatami, yes, yeah. Well, but I'll answer that, yeah.
But as far as we know, he's come out as opening Ahmadinejad, and it's kind of, there's a concern that he's abandoned that. Mm-hmm. So if you could answer that, and also your questions about Iran not wanting a nuclear bomb, I agree with you that a military attack could completely make them abandon it. And I'm not the only Israeli who believes that.
No,
there
I know
are many
that,
others,
yeah.
and I can tell you the majority of Israeli people want a peaceful solution to this. But how can we convince the international community that Iran has a right, and Iran does have an inalienable right to a nuclear energy, when the IAEA found secret plans for Iran to build a nuclear warhead, and El Baradei hid it, and it was handed over to the Guardian. It's called the secret dossier. How can, when you have that?
Well, Iran claims that dossier is a forgery, so.
That comes from the IAEA,
I know,
who they deal with.
I know,
so.
yeah. And they claim that the IAEA is controlled by the CIA. I mean, you know, there's all those things. I mean, having a nuclear warhead designs or plans to have, to build a nuclear, I don't think that I certainly think that there's been work done on it in the last 30 years, that Iranian scientists have certainly thought about building a nuclear weapon. First of all, you can get plans for nuclear warheads on the internet. It's not that hard. But in terms of designs and plans and forget about whether it's a forgery or not, I don't doubt that they've played around with that in the past. I think it would have been foolish for them not to play around with it in the past, when they have Pakistan on one side with nuclear weapons, obviously Israel on the other side with nuclear weapons, and so on and so forth. But the question wasn't whether they've ever had plans or whether they at one point thought about it or whatever. How do you convince the international? I think goes back to the answer I gave, is that the only way to convince the international community that Iran is not building nuclear weapons is to have these snap inspections that the additional protocol calls for, to have more intrusive inspections. And as long as that happens, you have a control at least over what's happening there. In terms of the Khamenei question, it's funny because I was in Iran actually when Khamenei said that about Ahmadinejad, well before the election, said that it was back in September, I think, of 2008, where he said that in a cabinet meeting, he said you don't act as if you've only got another 9 months in office. Act as if you. And I called former President Khatami's chief of staff, and he said, well, he actually said the same thing to us. So he said it's not relevant. They were not, at that point, the opposition did not take that as a sign. They took it as a sign that, yes, I mean, this is what he's going to say to him. And they also knew that he was probably going to support Ahmadinejad. But they certainly, back then, they didn't think that he would try to annul a vote or try to cheat on the level that they've accused him of backing a fraudulent election. I don't know. My own personal view is, and this is speculation, is always going to be speculation. My own personal view goes back to what I said earlier, is the Supreme Leader certainly has no love for Ahmadinejad on a personal level. He certainly has no love for him for his handling of the economy. He doesn't, although he thinks that Ahmadinejad probably can get away with the subsidies plan, getting rid of the subsidies in Iran, better than a reformist can. Only because he's oldor, as they say in Farsi. He's the kind of guy who could just do it and, screw everyone. Exactly. But most importantly, I think his concern is foreign relations. And I think that's the reason, if there was fraud and if it was on that level that we assume it was, and we assume that Mousavi lost because of that, I think there was a realization on his part that, and this is speculation, I'm just guessing.
For those we've got to go around that. We're running out of time, but for those interested in cloak and dagger stories on warhead devices, the last chapter of Jim Risen's book, for which he won the Pulitzer, in disclosing the the spy system on U.S. citizens, goes into this fascinating case where the CIA tried to get the Iranian delegation in Vienna to the IAEA to absorb this nuclear warhead design that was an old Russian design that had been modified by Los Alamos Labs in hopefully non-obvious ways so that they could influence that issue. But the Russian defector, who was supposedly angry at America for the way he had been treated and was going to leave this there, was so afraid that they would know that how he had modified this would be caught, and that he would be blamed, that he actually wrote a note to them saying,
the Iranians,
what happened. It's a really incredible chapter, so you should take a look at it. And I think it for me plants a bit of doubt about secret dossiers of any kind. Yeah. So just to plant that. So I'm going to cluster some questions. There are too many of you, and we don't have enough time. This gentleman in the back, and then we'll go to the gentleman in the blue shirt, then Diane, then here, and then I'm going to and then Al. But we're going to just cluster them quickly. You've got a pen? No. Here's a pen. Here's a piece of paper. So brevity, please. And
actually, I do have.
Go ahead.
Stanley Kober with the Cato Institute. How do you assess the loyalty of the IRGC and the Basiji?
Thank you. This gentleman here.
Jason Miller, Project on Middle East Democracy. I'm curious about, we have Khamenei going to Qom shortly, and there has been a lot of discussion lately on divisions within the clerical community. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Thank you. Let's give it to Al. You had...
On the assumption that the elections of 2009 have tarnished democracy as a tool of legitimacy, what tools remain in the Iranian leadership hardliner playbook that they best retain popular support from anti-Israel threats of Israel to economic populism and so on?
Thank you. Interesting question. Diane Perlman.
Diane Perlman, Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. George Mason, thanks for your analysis. I just want to comment about Article 4 of the NPT, which is the so-called inalienable right to so-called peaceful uses, and that, first of all, it's not an alienable right by definition, and that the NPT was formed around the IAEA, and and a lot of the NGOs at the NPT are proposing an international renewable energy agency to supplant that. But as long as we are pushing for nuclear power, and the nuclear power industry has spent $665 million on branding as safe and clean. So anyway, it's a problem, and the conflict is unnecessary, is manufactured by that.
Okay, thank you. And then right here. Try to cluster all of these, but the only way we can do it.
Yeah,
you're a very extensive answerer, so we have to.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
In the immediate aftermath of the June 2009 elections, President Obama was rather silent over the crackdown, and it was said that he was probably silent so as not to jeopardize possible nuclear negotiations in the future. I'm wondering, what was the reaction of Iranians within Iran, both the conservatives and the Green movement? Did they care at all? Was it just the Green movement that was disappointed, and was the disappointment more prevalent perhaps among the diaspora rather than within Iran?
Good question. Thank you. Hooman, the floor is yours.
Okay. The loyalty of the IRGC and the Basij, I assume the question was loyalty to the supreme leader as opposed to loyalty to Ahmadinejad, because I've always maintained, we hear a lot about the IRGC being a takeover of the government by the IRGC, or the IRGC really runs the country. The reality really is that the IRGC are military men, they're soldiers. The leader of the Revolutionary Guard Study, the commander, Aziz Jafari, is a veteran of, he was 18 when he joined. Military people tend to be loyal to their commander-in-chief. The commander-in-chief is Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, not Ahmadinejad. And I think it's my own view that if Supreme Leader Khamenei had said, we're backing Mousavi, and he won, that the IRGC would have gone along with that. If as he said, we're backing Ahmadinejad, they went along with it. So it's like any military organization, they're ultimately going to be, they're not going to be mutinous unless, in some cases they are. But in Iran's case, I think they're very loyal still to the supreme leader and to the Velayat Faqih, the system, and their roots. The second question was about Khamenei going to Qom, I think, this week, and about the clerical divide. I don't think there's any question that there's a clerical divide. There has been for a long time, since before the elections of 2009. Clearly, people know about Montazeri, who was the most prominent of the dissident clerics, who was in jail and in house arrest for all those years and died obviously last year. But there's always been dissident clerics. That's why I titled my last book, The Ayatollah Begs to Differ. That was what it was referring to, the fact that there isn't this homogenous kind of everybody's monolithic opinion of how to run the country or what an Islamic democracy is. I think Khamenei going to Qom is again, it's my opinion that he's trying to gain the support of as many clerics as he can at a time when he has been criticized rather more openly and rather more with a lot more criticism since 2009 from the most senior ayatollahs in some cases. He still does have support, and he obviously has the ability, financial ability, to give money to these clerics and to their mosques and their seminaries, which gets him a lot of support anyway. But this is a problem for him, and it will continue to be a problem for him for a while. Support from the other clerics, or clerics who are actually who are actually senior to him from a religious standpoint. I don't want to spend too much time on that. What are the tools for popular support? Well, the biggest tool for popular support is the economy. I was criticized for an article I wrote in Foreign Policy right after I came back from Iran, and one of the things I said in that article was that I spoke to somebody who was actually very much against, who's working class and has no money, works as a servant basically, and he had said he hates Ahmadinejad, he hates Khamenei, he hates the Islamic system, he hates everything about Iran. And he said to me, and I said this in the article, I actually made it a little bit less incendiary than it was. He said to me, if this government takes care of me, if this government gets me a good job or a good salary, I'll spy for them. I'll inform I'll kill my neighbor for that. I mean, now he was joking about killing, but because he laughed then. But he said I'd even spy on my neighbor. I'd be 100% supporter of this system if they could guarantee me $1,000 a month. So I think the economy plays a big role for the support, and I think that the Iranian government knows that and the leadership knows that. Much like in any other country, if President Obama could solve the economic problems of the United States, I think that he would be one of the most popular presidents in history. And I think that if he can't, he's going to be an unpopular president. I think the same is true of any guy. I think it's the same in Iran. The Iranian people, at the end of the day, yes, do they want more freedom? Absolutely. But are they willing at this point to give up that freedom in order for a better economy? I don't know if it's that kind of equation. Are they willing to give up an economy for freedom? Probably not at this point. There was actually a couple more. The NPT, I'm not sure what the question was, so I'll get to that last. The Obama and Obama's silence. Well, that's an interesting question because the reaction, I think, was greater in the diaspora than it was in Iran. There's no question that in Iran, I mean, we see this time and again in almost every article that's written about the Green Movement or about the political situation in Iran, or people who are anti-regime always bring up the fact that demonstrators, said, Obama, you're either with us or against us. Well, that's true. That was one of the chants. That was not a chant by Mousavi. That was not something that was sanctioned by the Green Movement. Some of the demonstrators tore up pictures of Ayatollah Khomeini. Mousavi's reaction to that was that either the CIA did that or the government did that to discredit us, because all it was doing was discrediting Mousavi. Certainly the Green Movement leaders weren't looking for support. And I don't think Obama, in my opinion, and I haven't spoken to him about this obviously, I don't think the Obama administration didn't support the Green Movement openly because of the nuclear issue. I think that they probably recognize that it's probably not a good idea to do that, because if you do, then you are going to taint them with this idea that they were already being accused of being tools of the West, that they're going to be tools of the West. And I do think obviously the nuclear issue was also probably somewhere in there because they do want to resolve that. But the sentiment in Iran is not that the people are saying, "Oh, come save us, America, come save us, Obama, come save us." There are certainly people who would like Obama to be much more inside Iran. There's certainly people who would like Obama. Those people who chanted that slogan. They weren't like one or two people. There were a number of people, maybe thousands of people who would like Obama or the United States to be much, much more supportive of the Green movement because they probably feel that would help them. But the leadership, and at all levels of the leadership, including those who've been in prison, have not suggested that Obama would be doing the right thing in supporting the Green movement.
I mean, if I may, on that issue, the argument in the White House was divided between those two. It is our objective to create revolution in Iran and regime change in Iran, or is our objective to get what had been in play before that election, which was a very serious and earnest strategic dialogue and discussion trying to seduce Iran in a different course away from nuclear weapons. And at the time, the calculation was that the priority was to maintain the effort of trying to stop a breakout of nuclear weapons capacity in Iran. And I completely understand that, and that would have been where I would have advised, but people like Vice President Biden and others have privately said that they thought that the White House should have expressed more common empathy, if you will, and concern for those people in the streets. I mean, it divided this institution here, too.
Well, in fairness to President, fairness to President Obama, he did come out on a number of occasions and express empathy.
Since, right.
Yeah, well, even when Neda was killed, for example, on the streets of Tehran and the violence and all that. Hillary was a little bit more vocal about it, but I think Obama did come out.
Right, but the idea was to maintain that priority of a strategic track as opposed to, falling into a kind of a John Bolton groove, if you will.
Yeah. And the last question, the NPT question, I didn't really understand what the question was, because was there a specific question in terms of this?
Why don't you give Diane the mic real quickly?
Well, it was more of a comment. Well, you said people believe in the inalienable right and that they have a right, and that some of that conflict is contrived. And I mean, if you could just comment your
Well, my comment is basically that I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not saying that the Iranians have the right interpretation of the NPT. I don't know. I could, but I can tell you that the Iranian people believe that they have the right, and as long as that belief is there, that's all that matters. Because
I think that's what the Iranian people believe. The other interesting issue, George Soros once told me that Iran is this before the election, a fake democracy, and my response to him was, it's interesting, it probably is a fake democracy, but actually, if you talk to the people, they believe in their democracy, they believe they have rights, which explains much of the behavior that we saw in the so-called Green Movement, that they felt that they had been. Many of them had felt ripped off. Now, Flint Leverett thinks I'm completely wrong, but it was an interesting stakeholders argument. And in my own dialogue, I worked very hard. Nico Pitney of Huffington Post, but also my blog at the Washington Note, we really tried hard to find accessible sources inside the power establishment inside Iran. And we succeeded in some ways to get reflections back. And when you get, I've saved these emails, which I will 25 years from now, put out there. But it is interesting to see the stakeholders in the regime essentially express their disgust with what they saw were violations of their democratic rights, which is, as an American that has a slightly different view of what democracy looks like, it is interesting to have heard that discourse. Hooman, it's always fascinating to have you, and as I started out this, I said I've become, not to dislike, but just to be disgruntled with a lot of book events, but I love hanging out with you and thinking through these issues, and I want to give people an opportunity to talk with you and ask people not to rush the stage because I want you to buy the book. This time it's a really good book that you should really get, and you should chat with Hooman, who's really fascinating and has so many vignettes and personal relationships, and as I said, he's one of the few people who still has access and talks to elites in Iran, and also is communicating that over here. It's very, very hard
not
to do
the
that.
U.S. government.
Yeah, no, I was just,
I do want to just add one thing because there are Iranian Americans in the audience. I just want to say in terms of sanctions, for example, and how they hurt ordinary people, they don't just hurt ordinary people inside Iran. They even have starting to hurt Iranian Americans. A friend of mine came back from Tehran last week and arrived. She'd gone to visit her mother, an American. She'd gone to visit her ailing mother, old mother, and got back and discovered that her Chase Manhattan or Chase bank accounts had all been frozen. Why? Because she tried to she tried to pay some bills online from Iran. And because she tried to access her bank account from Iran. Now, this is what Chase said to her. Chase said to her, which I think is actually probably either not true or is illegal anyway. That the State Department informed that if anybody tries to access their accounts from Iran, that their accounts should be frozen. First of all, the State Department doesn't have that authority. I think the Treasury Department has the authority to tell a bank what to do.
It's Mr. Stuart Levy.
But anyway, the point I'm making is that the sanctions are even hurting. And this is a person who despises the regime, obviously is not someone who has chosen to live there and doesn't like them and all that, but is saying that, and this is someone who actually really wants this regime to change, and is very distressed at what these sanctions are doing. So there are things like that as well.
Well, thank you so much, Hooman. Thank you very much. So, see that gentleman over there with the beard?